Welcome back to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess.
And I'm Kyle. Jess, how's your week been?
Well, Kyle, you might be able to tell that I have a pretty bad cold at the minute. I obviously I know, we might have to pause so I can blow my nose. I've obviously been traveling for the last couple of weeks, so big thanks to Sean for stepping in while I was away. I did get snowed in last week. My flight was canceled because of snow, but I got a snow day out of it, which was fun.
Been a while. Well, I was going to say it's been a while since I've had a snow day. I don't think I ever had a snow day, Jess.
Well, that's what you get for growing up in Southern California. I mean, we don't get a lot of snow days in Seattle, but we had probably more than you did.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, definitely did not have snow days. Had a couple fire days. That was fun.
Wow. Well, that's not quite as fun. No, it was a lot of snow. I think it was like 16 or 17 inches in New York City
Oh my
on
God.
Monday. I know. I mean, it was like actually, you'll appreciate this. I had to go out on a mission for coffee, but the coffee place that I'd been going to was closed, and I knew that they were going to be closed. But thank God the other coffee place nearby was opening a little bit late, but they opened. But it was so funny. It was like this oasis in the desert, and it was absolutely rammed because clearly everyone wanted to get out of the house. But it was really funny. It was like, because at that point it was still blizzarding, so it was really windy, and you're like walking down the street, and the snow is like driving in your face, and you're like, coffee, it's so close, coffee.
New Yorkers are serious about getting their coffee, so I'm not surprised that place was rammed. Yeah.
Exactly. It was very funny. But anyway, how are you? Where are you coming to us live from? Because there's going to be some funny noises in the background, I think.
Obviously, I'm not in my normal setup. I'm coming from Costa Rica.
Amazing.
So you're probably hearing a lot of tropical birds.
There's
and
a lot of birds
noises
in the background. A lot of birds.
So I found the one quiet patio, but I've got some sun coming in. I've got some birds in the distance. So hopefully it's not too distracting for the audience, but we're going to, it's a little unusual version of the podcast this week. But we'll try to
exactly. Well,
the wind's picking up, so we'll see how that goes.
We'll see how that goes, but we'll power through. How is Costa Rica though? It's looked amazing, the pictures that you were posting.
Costa Rica's been spectacular.
Very jealous.
Weather's been great. Has been very windy, and so that has been challenging because I'm here doing a lot of surfing, and so the wind definitely makes it a little challenging to surf. There was one day where literally, like, you would pick up your board and it would just like pull you like 50 feet down the beach. It was like you were carrying a sail. So that's a little tough. Yeah.
Well, I hope I'm glad you've had fun, and hopefully next week we'll both be back to full strength.
Yeah, wish me luck. I've got my flight tonight to get back and start everything anew tomorrow.
So let's get into it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about something that's been all over my social media feed for the last couple of weeks. Have you seen this QuitGPT
I have,
thing?
and I've seen that it's starting to grow, so I think it's pretty hard to miss at this point.
Yeah, it is, and that's why we wanted to cover it. So for anyone who hasn't come across this yet, here's a quick version. In early February, there was a grassroots campaign that started spreading across Reddit and Instagram called QuitGPT, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You cancel your ChatGPT subscription, and you move on to another LLM. They're claiming that there's around 700,000 signups on their pledge site, although that number is a little unclear. Tech Radar puts the confirmed pledges closer to 17,000, but anyway, it's
a big difference.
Big difference there, big difference. But it's a big enough thing that both you and I have seen quite a bit of it. So it's clearly moved beyond the tech forums into mainstream.
There are a few distinct threads, which I think is, one to cover. So one is political. So there are reports about, major donations from OpenAI leadership to a pro-Trump super PAC. And for anyone, we're not going to get into super PACs, but there are black boxes of funding. That didn't sit well with a chunk of OpenAI's user base. Another reason is about government contracts, specifically concerns about OpenAI models being used in tools for agencies like ICE, which we've made our stance on that fairly well known. And then there's a third thread that's more product frustration, which is the model sunsetting situation. And then I'll just add in another one, which is just people, I think, getting more aware of other models and seeing what's out there. So I think there's also some experimentation happening.
Yeah, and I think It's funny because I was talking about this the other day with a friend who's not technical whatsoever, and she was talking about the fact that she barely uses chat anymore. She actually calls him Chad. She really hates
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
She's like, "Oh, Chad's being an asshole today." But it's because she doesn't like the way that it writes, and she
Mhm.
mostly uses it for writing, and she really hates its style, and so she's moved away from it almost completely. So I think that's part of it as well, is like I think sometimes it feels like while technically the models are getting better from a day-to-day experience, it's
Mhm.
getting worse. But I think this also rolls into the what you had just talked about with the model deprecation, which was announced in January that they were retiring GPT
Mhm.
and a couple of others, and they didn't give very much notice, which a lot of people were really pissed about. A lot of people really, really liked that model. And especially if you built any kind of workflow or internal tool around that specific model, if they sunset it, it's really disruptive. It becomes a reliability issue.
And that's a real concern. It's the one that I think gets lost when QuitGPT gets framed purely as a political story, because the model deprecation situation raises a legitimate question about lock-in risk. What happens to your business processes when the specific tool you've optimized for disappears on short notice?
So that's why we wanted to talk about this today, because Quit GPT, whatever you think of it, has done something pretty useful. And it's made a lot of people who were just defaulting to ChatGPT out of habit actually stop and ask, is this actually the best option for what I need?
And the answer, which we're going to spend the rest of this episode on, is it depends on what you need. But there are genuinely excellent alternatives. And we've talked a lot about some of those or brought them up. But we want to basically give a really specific episode that addresses each of these. And some of them are actually better suited to specific business jobs than ChatGPT ever was. So it's a really good time for people to start exploring alternatives. And I will bring up just one other point, which is like I was talking to Sean, our guest,
Hmm.
who we had on last couple of weeks. He's actually moving over to Claude entirely for his entire workflow because he's finding he likes Claude better for all of his business needs. So I think it's a really good time to start thinking about what else is out there.
Absolutely. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be talking about Claude, Perplexity, Gemini, Mistral, and I'll flag that DeepSeek exists. We're not going to go too deep into it because it's not necessarily the best for small businesses, but we just want to,
Okay.
it does exist. I will also say that we're actually going to we're going to talk about Claude last, mostly because we have a news story that is related to Claude. So we thought they segued nicely into each other. So
Mhm.
stick around for Claude because obviously that's a tool that you and I both use a lot.
Yes.
So let's get into it. Okay. So ChatGPT is obviously still the name that comes up first in almost every conversation about AI. Ask Chat has become a real thing. It's the one that people use the most for sure. It's the default. But the market's matured a lot in the last year or two, and there's some really excellent tools out there. So we wanted to cover them and look at what the other options might be.
And to be clear or upfront, this isn't a ChatGPT is bad episode. We're specifically leaving ChatGPT out of today's conversation. This is about the alternatives and helping understand what each one is actually for, so that if you are interested in switching, you are best prepared or you have some good information about which one you might want to check out.
Yeah, because I think there's a mistake that most people make, and that's assuming that there's one best AI tool and they just need to find that one best tool. But the more that I think both of us actually use these tools, the more we realize they are specialists, and the real skill
Mhm.
is knowing which specialists to use.
And so I think for the plan today, we're going to answer three questions. What is it good at? Who is it genuinely for? But also, where does it fall down? Where are some of the pitfalls and how to basically avoid those? And also, for anyone listening in Europe, we're making sure we flag the EU friendly options because data residency isn't a hypothetical concern for a lot of business. It's actually something you need to plan and have a strategy around.
Okay, Perplexity. So this one is actually a little bit different than the Claudes and the ChatGPTs of the world. So let's talk about what sets this one apart, but actually what it's really good at, because it is very good. It's just a little bit
Mhm.
different.
So you have to look under the hood because I think
Mhm.
it helps understand why it's useful. So most AI tools, and Claude included, which we'll get to, are drawing primarily on their training data when they answer you. So This means that there's a knowledge cutoff. Anything that happened recently or anything that requires current information is either a gap or it has to use tools that they've now added on to do web search.
Mhm.
Perplexity, however, is built inherently differently. So it's actively going out and searching the internet in real time when you ask it a question. Like that's built in already. It doesn't require a secondary like web search, if that makes sense. So it asks a question, it reads sources, and then it synthesizes an answer from what it finds. And the bit that really matters is every single claim it makes, it comes with a citation. And I think that's the part that is probably most unique, or at least has been the most unique from the beginning. Now we're starting to get that with the other models, but this really provides you a clickable source that you can go and verify. So I think we're going to talk about why that's relevant, but you can think about when you're doing research, how that can be really useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all had this happen. And to be fair, I had this happen with Perplexity when I was first using it at some point last year, where it was hallucinating facts. This is before they added the citation onto everything. So I will give them that they made a big change. But, this is obviously one of the fundamental limitations of any LLM. They can hallucinate, they can present outdated information like it's a current fact, and they just do it with full, with their full chest.
Yeah.
Perplexity essentially shows it's working, which is, for a business use case or if you're doing research, it's really, really, really useful.
And the use cases where this really matters, is competitive research, market sizing, regulatory questions. So a lot of those business use cases that are going to be really relevant to doing high level strategic thinking around the business, anything where you're going to present that information to someone else or make a decision based on it, you need to be able to verify the source. You can't just trust the AI, which is what I think a lot of the other models are pushing you or forcing you to do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I use Perplexity a lot for my newsletter. That's actually where I start with it. Once I find a story, I will go to Perplexity. I'll ask it to give me additional sources and additional background. And then I will take that and I'll use that to actually write the article. So Perplexity is an absolutely integral part of my newsletter process. And then I'll actually, once I use Claude for the actual written sections, I will put it back in Perplexity and ask it to fact check it for me and to
Mhm.
make sure that everything is cited, just so that I quadruple check that everything is correct. So Perplexity is like just so, so good for this.
There's also a feature called Spaces, which is basically a way to set up a persistent research environment around a specific topic. So if you're tracking a particular competitor or an industry trend or a regulatory area that matters to your business, you can essentially create a dedicated research hub that you come back to and add to over time. So it's not just for one-off queries, but it can also set up a really nice, like ongoing research project for you.
I actually did not know about this feature until we started working on this episode. So I'm going to start using this going forward for the newsletter, because I actually think this is a really, really good way of keeping track of things in this space.
Mhm.
So thanks, early adopter, for teaching us new things.
That is the great thing. We're always learning new things here.
Always,
But
always learning, always learning.
yeah, and I mean, the great thing, just like when you set up a project and other AI
Yeah.
tools, once you set this up and keep adding to it, you've had a living document of sourced information on whatever matters specific to your business around that specific topic. And I think the fact that it's topic specific is really
Yeah.
useful and genuinely underused. I mean, quite frankly, I haven't used it all that
No.
much either.
I think the one thing that we wanted to caveat about Perplexity is that Perplexity is not a writing tool. It's not where you go to draft a campaign or to write a newsletter. I would never use Perplexity to actually write my newsletter. Again, I just use it for research. It's an information engine. It's not a content engine. And that distinction is quite important, because if you try and use it for writing, it's just not going to be very good. It's okay, but it's not on the level of some of the others.
Yeah, and that's because the underlying models it uses are good at generating text, but the product is optimized for retrieval and synthesis, not for crafting. And so that really goes into like how it was built. So if you need something that's going to be read by a customer or go out publicly, I would say take what Perplexity gives you and then finish it somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree. And something else to flag is that Perplexity actually has quite a few deals with a lot of news publishers and stuff. So it's a pretty
Mhm.
trusted source when it comes to actually pulling from
Mhm.
publishers, because it's pulling directly from a news site rather than just scraping the internet.
Cost wise, the free tier of Perplexity gives you a limited number of pro searches per day, which is honestly enough to get a feel for whether it which is honestly enough to get a feel for whether it fits your workflow before you commit to it. The paid plan is around $20 a month, as is every tool,
Ev
right?
everything.
And that will unlock a lot more volume, gives you access to stronger underlying models for more complex research tasks, but try the free tier first.
And one final thing on Perplexity, well, two final things on Perplexity. I use the free version for this. I never bother with the pro version because I just don't, even with the amount that I use it, I actually don't feel like I need the pro. Although if
Yeah.
I want to try this new feature, then maybe I will need to pay for it. But also, fun fact, they just ditched advertising. So OpenAI is doubling down on adding advertising into ChatGPT. Perplexity just got rid of their sponsored
Mm,
posts and things and claimed
love that.
it was for trust. So I just thought that was interesting. Okay, let's move on to Google's Gemini. And I want to frame this one pretty carefully because the value proposition is very specific with Gemini. If your
Mhm.
team lives in Google Workspace, which a lot of businesses do, we use it. I use it, have used it for many different companies I've worked for. Gemini is a really, really good option. If you don't use Google Workspace, it's negligible, but Google have really been putting a lot of effort into their AI in the last year or
Mhm.
two. So, it's definitely getting better all the time. But if you do use Google Workspace, it's a very easy transition.
Gemini's main advantage isn't that it's the best AI model, although, just as you pointed out, it's really improving, and
Yeah.
I've been pretty impressed with it lately.
Yeah.
But its main advantage is that it's already inside the tools where most small businesses, most teams actually do their
Yeah.
work. So Gmail, Docs, Sheets, Slides, Drive, Calendar, it's all part of that overall Google ecosystem. So the friction is pretty low, and you don't have to context switch to get to kind of that separate AI tab or that separate AI workspace or application. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've probably all, if you use Google, you've probably already come across this where Gemini has popped up for doing whatever. So for something like summarizing an email or for giving you actions from meeting notes, it's super easy. It's already built into the conversations that you're having. So it just means you're not bouncing between different tabs or whatever. Everything is
Mhm.
just condensed in Google. It just makes life a lot easier because it's already there.
And it runs through the whole suite. So in
Yeah.
Docs, you can highlight a section, rewrite it, expand it, change the tone. In Google Sheets, it helps with formulas, data cleaning, basic analysis. In Slides, it can generate outlines. So the integration is really deep, and that's a really strong selling point.
Yeah, and the multimodal capability is also worth mentioning. So you can hand Gemini as a spreadsheet, a product photo, and an email chain all at once and ask it to reason across them together. And then that combined context is really
Mm.
useful for pulling things like a client brief together from multiple sources. So that's really helpful.
However, the writing quality compared to Claude or even ChatGPT is noticeably flatter and a little
Yeah.
bit more difficult to get good quality out of that.
Yeah.
For operational writing, summaries, internal documentations, or structured content, I think it's fine.
Yeah,
For anything
totally.
like customer facing that needs voice and nuance, or if you're really trying to build a tone over time, I don't think it's the best tool for that. You'll probably want to take what Gemini gives you and elevate it, or change some of the tones. Use that somewhere else to get better output.
If you're summarizing a meeting, it's great. If you're trying to write anything else, you
Mhm.
probably want to take it elsewhere. And we
Mhm.
should also mention that Gemini has some well documented accuracy issues. So there's been some controversies around image generation and some factual errors that have gotten a fair amount of attention.
One more thing that I want to flag that is a little bit outside of the like Gemini
Yeah.
environment, but I think is really important as as to the capabilities is Notebook LM.
Yeah.
So this is a separate Google AI product, but it's excellent for like a very specific use
Yeah.
case, which is if you upload documents to it, like PDFs or articles, notes, whatever you have, it will create an interactive research environment where you can ask questions about your sources and it only answers from what you've given it. So this is like we've talked about RAG in the past, which is retrieval augmented
Yeah.
generation, where you're using your data as context for the AI to answer. Notebook LM is a quick and easy way to basically build a RAG system. And it's really, really good. So It can even generate audio summaries in a podcast style format,
Hmm.
which is very cool, but it can really do a lot around Notebook LM. It also kind of feels like that spaces that you have Perplexity, where it's very project specific. So it's a really useful tool as part of the overall Google ecosystem.
Yeah, I would second that. I use Notebook LM for a big project I was working on at the end of last year where I did something like 30 interviews and I uploaded the transcript from all of those interviews into Notebook LM. And then when I needed to double check something about what did so and so say about this, I could go back
Hmm.
and check it through that. So it's very, very useful for that. And it's free. It's worth trying. They do hide it a little bit in Google. You do have to dig around to try and find it, but it's very different than anything else, but definitely worth flagging. So good one to add in there.
Yeah, and I'll give my use case. I was doing some product research, and we did interviews with like 20 different people about their pain points and their
Hmm.
challenges. I uploaded all the transcripts of those video interviews, and then it became basically like my research to
Yeah.
ask questions about and come up with insights. So it's really useful if you're trying to do something very topic specific.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is gonna sound very familiar. Pricing on Gemini is around $20 a month, right?
Yep.
But if you're on a business or enterprise workspace tier, so if you like have your business on a domain specific Gmail, you then will have access. It's already included or available. So you
Yep.
won't need to pay anything more for that.
Yep. So, bottom line, if you are a Google Workspace user, this is the most frictionless AI upgrade that you can make because it already meets your team where they are. If you're not in that ecosystem, the integration argument doesn't really work, and there are probably better places to start. But
Hmm.
if you already work with Google, great, give it a try.
Hmm.
Okay, Mistral. This one is for a very specific audience, and less for everyone else. So, as someone who works a lot within the European ecosystem, I wanted to make sure that we included it because I know that we do have listeners in Europe and outside the US. So that's why we wanted to make sure that we're not going to go too deep into this one, but just to flag that it is around and an option.
Yeah. So if you're based in Europe, or if you're in a regulated industry, I also think that's important.
Yeah.
So that could be healthcare, legal, financial services, or if you're a very technical founder building AI into a product and cost efficiency matters, I think Mistral is the tool you should be looking at. If none of those apply, take what's useful and maybe move on here.
So Mistral is a French AI company. The key structural difference from everything else we've covered is that a significant part of its model family is open weight, meaning that the model itself can be downloaded and run on your own servers. Go back and listen to our episodes on small language models if you want to
Mhm.
learn more about that. So it's not through anyone else's cloud. It's on infrastructure that you control, which is one of the reasons why it's really good for regulated industries.
And for non technical listeners, why that matters when you use Claude or Gemini, your data goes through Anthropic's or Google servers. That's generally fine. But for certain businesses, especially regulatory ones, or in Europe where data residency is really important, that's a really hard constraint. So your data has to stay in a specific location under your control, just period, right? Especially with GDPR in Europe, this is a real obligation, not a preference.
Yeah, so for something like healthcare startups who are handling patient data or law firms processing confidential documents, the ability to run your AI completely within your own environment
Mhm.
is sometimes the only way that you can use AI at all. So it is
Yep.
actually really, really important.
I will say also, Mistral is competitive on
Yeah.
standard business tasks. So, summarization, drafting, structured extraction of documents, it all holds up very well across other models. So, it's not necessarily a mediocre trade off, but just can be in your own environment. But it is like, efficient, it's pretty good, but it has those EU and data residency friendly availability. So, it's a great alternative.
Yeah, and also something to flag is that there is a real push in Europe at the minute to move away from US owned software, whether that's AI or
Mhm.
other types. So Mistral is a good option if you are a European based company or founder and you want to have another option. In terms of like it's actually how it actually works, we run the same tasks through both Claude and Mistral, and anything requiring nuance or complex reasoning or creative judgment, Claude probably produces better output. Mistral is really strong on structured, well-defined tasks. It's weaker on the ambiguous, judgment-heavy work where Claude is really good. So
Mhm.
that's just something to bear in mind. But again, Mistral has its pros. Just depends on what you're looking for.
And the real issue, I think, is going to be the barrier to entry is higher. So if
Yeah,
you don't have someone technical on your team, Mistral probably isn't going to be your starting point just because it does take some technical know-how to get set it
yeah.
up. The self-hosted setup requires someone comfortable with making infrastructure decisions. That being said, using Claude or ChatGPT to help you set up Mistral, it's ironic, but you could
Doable.
probably get there. It's
Yeah.
definitely doable.
They do have Le Chat, which I just love the name of that. That's their consumer-facing interface, and it's improved a lot. If you want to try the models without having to deal with the self-hosted side of things, that's a pretty reasonable way to test it before you go too far into the really technical stuff.
Yeah. So the bottom line for Mistral is for the right business and the right use case, especially if you're
Yeah.
based in the EU, Mistral's case is really strong. For most of our listeners, though, it's worth knowing about rather than probably adopting immediately. Maybe something to check out or look for if you're trying to get deeper into these AI models.
Yeah. Okay. Last one. We saved this one for last on purpose. Save the best till last, all of that. We are very noticeably pro Claude, and so we wanted to save it for the last, but also there's a news story that is related to Claude, so we kind of thought it would be a nice segue.
Yeah. I'm also pro Claude. I think I've been talking about it for a long time. I
Yeah.
think I'm on like the max subscription now because
Wow.
I use it for Claude Code. I use it for co-work. I'm pretty deep in Claude. So take that, take my bias and with a grain of salt.
I know we are quite biased with this.
Yeah.
So, fair warning. So, Claude is obviously made by Anthropic. And what's interesting about covering it last is that we've talked about what the other tools do really well. So, Perplexity does research, Gemini, if you're in the Google workspace, Mistral for the EU, and Claude sits above all of those as like a really deep thinking, heavy lifting tool. So, this is the one that you bring in when the job is actually really important. It's customer facing or, anything along those
Mhm.
lines, a lot of coding, all that stuff.
Mhm.
This is where Claude really excels.
That's a really good way to frame it. And the reason it can do that is the technical foundation that it has. So it's able to handle long, complex inputs. Also, the context window. So how much data it can you can give it, which is or how much you can give it to work with at once is large enough that you could paste in full documents, 60-page reports, a pile of different meeting transcripts, and it can process all of that. So the fact that it has really large context windows and is able to read through that really well means that the output piece seems really detailed and specific and rich.
I talk about Claude a lot. I use it a lot for writing, but I actually had a massive strategy document, which I think you've seen. It's like a 30-page strategy
Mhm.
document that I created a couple of months ago with Claude. And I put in so much research, like probably
Mhm.
70 plus articles of worth of research for this strategy document. And it's brilliant. Like it was so
Mhm.
good. So, I can't say enough good things about Claude. It's my go-to.
And it's not just the context window length that makes it really successful, it's also how it reasons.
Yeah.
So structured, systematic, it breaks things down rather than just generating like fluid sounding prose or content. I think that's probably where it competes pretty well against ChatGPT, for instance. For anything where you really need to trust the output, and I think this is true for somewhat sensitive documents like a board memo,
Yeah.
or it's quite good at breaking down contracts as well or compliance documents. So think things that are like very difficult to understand. It's really good at analyzing and working on those. And so that ability to trust the outputs can sometimes matter more than the speed.
Very much so. The tone calibration is also worth flagging. It's really careful and accurate by default, which is a real bonus if you're generating anything that touches something like legal or HR or really sensitive customer communications. You're not getting that really annoying, sycophantic, breezy, overconfident answer that
Mhm.
inevitably will cause a problem down the line.
The downside or the caveat to all of this is that carefulness and its ability to really understand some complex documents can sometimes feel a little conservative or a little rigid when you're trying to push a more creative angle. That's maybe where ChatGPT can sometimes feel a little bit more verbose, or it can get capture tone a little better. With Claude, you can do it. You just have to push it a little bit more and work on that prompt to understand better the tone, the creative narrative you're trying to provide, and then maybe give it more examples of what you're trying to get. So you can do it. It's just a little bit more difficult than it might be with ChatGPT.
Yeah. So the chat product is one thing, but I also want to talk about what Anthropic has been building around Claude, because I think a lot of people still think of it as that
Hmm.
conversational context where you're talking with it, and Claude is actually much, much more than that now, which is something we covered in our co-work episode a couple of weeks
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah, and I think this is a good caveat because this actually feels where a lot of the AI tools are moving. I don't
Yeah.
know that the models that they're releasing are these huge, massive step ups. Although, for instance, Claude Opus 4.6, which they just released, is a really powerful upgrade. But I think what the models are doing now is kind of all of the tools and all of the more agentic thinking that they're adding to their models is where like a lot of the innovation is coming from. So, for those of you who listen every week, we did a whole episode on Cowork just a few weeks ago, which is Anthropic's desktop tool for non-developers. This does file management, batch document processing. It automates a lot of the tedious computer admin that is quite frankly really annoying and probably we just never do. So, if you haven't listened to that one, go back. It's worth it. It sets up a little bit of what we're going to talk about
Mm.
right now.
Yeah, the co-work episode actually made me think really differently about Claude, because it's not just that chat anymore. It's really starting to
Mhm.
sit inside your actual work environment and take actions on your behalf with some useful guardrails, which I really like.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that I like the most about.
Yeah, so Cowork is a huge kind of upgrade, and I think for most people that's amazing. But I also want to get into the next one, which obviously I get genuinely excited about. And we covered this on our vibe coding episode. But that being said, I think there have been even some pretty big advancements even since we covered that episode. So just exactly what I'm going to
Of
say.
course, I know exactly what you're going to say. You are going to talk about your deep, deep love for Claude Code.
Yeah, Claude Code. It's still my favorite coding tool. It's been able to stay ahead of the game in many ways, which is impressive in this, AI ecosystem where things are just coming out all the time. Without getting too much into the technical, the important bit here is that you can hand it your entire code base, or you can set up an entire project in a markdown file. Describe what you need, give it the tech stack you want to build, the objectives of what you're trying to get, and it will build the whole thing from scratch. It navigates your files, it makes changes, it can run tests, it can check its own output and adjust. You can push it to Git. You can then directly deploy that into like a cloud instance. So you can effectively just build the whole thing from scratch and then see it work.
See,
Sorry, I
Kyle,
get a little excited
he
about
gets
this.
excited about this. You could very easily talk about Claude Code for ages. If you want 2 whole episodes on that, we went really deep into Claude Code on our vibe coding episodes. Go back
Yeah,
and
yeah.
check those out. But even for non-technical founders, I think it's worth understanding what Claude Code represents because, Kyle, you've talked a lot about this. It really changes the conversation about what a small team can actually
Mhm.
build.
Completely. A solo founder or a tiny team with Claude Code can move at a pace that would have required a much bigger engineering team 2 years ago. I cannot overstate this enough. It really is quite impressive. I would encourage everyone to try it out.
Yeah, and then there's actually a Claude for Excel even, which is the same idea applied to spreadsheets. So Anthropic is pretty clearly trying to do what Google has done with Gemini in Workspace. So they're really meeting people in the tools that they're already in rather than asking them to come somewhere new, which is great.
Yeah, and when you zoom out across all of it, so the chat product, Cowork, Claude Code, Claude for Excel, the through line is pretty clear. Claude as a layer that sits between you and your work. It's not just the AI that you consult or ask questions of, but the AI that handles things. And I think that's becoming a little bit of its differentiator and probably where it's going to start competing really strongly against ChatGPT.
That's really the key thing, right? When the AI is taking action, so things like
Mhm.
touching your files, writing and running code, processing documents. The model's judgment matters a lot. And if it's really overconfident, if it hallucinates and then acts on that hallucination, it ends up doing the wrong thing across that actual work. And the fact that Claude tends to be very careful, that it will pause and check rather than barrel ahead, that's a real bonus for me.
Cost wise, there's a free tier, obviously. There's Pro at around $20 a month. Then around the higher tiers, you have like the max subscription, which I think is $200 a month for much heavier usage. Cloud Code is accessed via an API or command line, depending on your setup. Cowork, they're still rolling out, but you can get the access to that on the desktop. So honestly, if you do want to look at Cowork, which I definitely encourage you to, go back and listen to the
Yep.
Cowork episode and the Vibe Coding series if you want the full picture.
And then just the one thing that we want to caveat is that native web research is not its strongest point. But at this point in the episode, we've already talked about Perplexity. Do what I do, use Perplexity for the research and Claude for
Mhm.
everything. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the major tools. Again, there is DeepSeek as well. We're not covering DeepSeek today because it's much more technical, I think, than most of our audience. But before we get into the actual like practical building of your AI stack, there's a little bit of a mindset shift that needs to happen first.
Yeah, the instinct, I think, and I started out this way too, is to want to find the best AI and just use that one tool. But I think the framing is that's a little off. Where we're getting to is these tools can somewhat be specialists or at least have strengths and weaknesses. You're not trying to get different professionals that work with you, like your accountant, to write your marketing copy. And I think you can think of your AI in a similar fashion. The value of, especially with where we're headed, is the value is coming from, or is going to come from knowing which specialist to call for which job.
So it also means that your AI stack should probably evolve with your business. So what you need as a solo founder is probably different than what you need managing a 12-person team. If you end up
Mhm.
signing up to Google Workspace at some point, then maybe you need to be looking at Gemini. You need to be flexible and
Yeah.
change with things as it goes.
Yeah. And also, we didn't really talk into this, but if you're in a really large enterprise, that's not really our audience. If you do find yourself that you are a big, large enterprise, you might have Copilot. And I have heard some good things about Copilot
Have
lately,
you? I've
shockingly.
not heard a single good thing about Copilot.
Only
Copilot is
very recently.
for people who are not aware, Microsoft is Copilot. For those of you who have to use Teams, you
Hmm.
might be stuck using Copilot, in which case, I'm so sorry. See if you can convince your business to get an enterprise
Yeah.
subscription to Claude. That's all I'm going to
Yeah,
say.
that's good. Although, I just will caveat that I've heard some good things lately. So we'll
I
see
have
if
I
maybe
have not.
Microsoft is picking
I've
up.
just heard of general hatred for all things Teams.
Exactly. But getting back to like how to build your tech stack, I think you should basically cap yourself at one paid tool. So I would probably recommend Claude Pro at the
Yeah.
$20 a month. It covers so many different, we talk about the specialist tools. It covers so much of what you can do, especially if you're a solo founder or a small team. You can then add on the free tier Perplexity, but maybe you're taking that information and then synthesizing it in Claude. That's maybe something that I would focus on. That can give you a lot of bang for your buck.
I mean, that's what I do, and it's served me very well. My advice is to use the free tiers of everything just to get a feel for them before you pay.
Mhm.
Like I said, I use Perplexity all the time, but only the free version. At some point,
Yeah.
I might upgrade to paid, but for the most part.
Now, let's say you're not a solo founder. Maybe you're a small team of 5 to 20 people, and you're trying to figure out how to give your team members or your employees access to a lot of these tools to, improve or upgrade their productivity. Especially if you live in Google Workspace, I would think about upgrading into Gemini's Pro version. Everyone's in Docs, Gmail, Sheets, all of that. That can be a really strong place for your team to live.
Yeah, this is where Gemini becomes really compelling. It's already inside the tools that your team is already using. You're not asking them to change their behavior. You're just enhancing what they already do, which is a much easier adoption path in practice.
And then I would add Claude as a secondary tool for whoever on your team is doing heavier analytical work, whether that's strategy documents, long form writing, deep analysis, especially on forms of documents or Excel that you can use with Cowork. Anything that needs more depth and nuance than maybe Gemini can do at the moment, give them access to a Claude Pro subscription with very defined, use cases.
So if you are a founder in Europe or you are in a regulated industry or where data sensitivity is a real concern, this is where Mistral really comes into play.
Yeah, the EU hosting and the open weight option can be real advantages that the other tools can't match because they are primarily cloud based. Obviously, there comes with caveats on that, but let's just say generally, you'll want some technical help to set it up
Yeah.
right. But if you can get that, it can definitely be worth it for your specific use case.
And you can actually still use Perplexity for research. That's generally considered EU compliant enough for most purposes. And especially because you're just doing research. It's not like you're using, it's not like you're using it for sensitive personal information or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
and the capability is genuinely useful regardless of where you're based.
So, speaking of tech stack, I think we should be explicit. I think, Jess, you and I have basically converged independently on the similar tech stack, which I think is telling, which is that we use primarily Claude for
Yeah.
synthesis, for drafting, for research, for that pseudo RAG documentation. But then we'll use Perplexity for like research, current information, really diving deep into market analysis and stuff like that. So we basically run them sequentially. Claude primarily for everything, Perplexity for the research, and then we'll feed some of that detail and data from Perplexity back into Claude for like the synthesis.
I think
Now you
that's
want to get rid of
enough.
that?
No,
Okay.
I think we're done. I think we're done now.
Okay.
Okay. Well, here I'll say this. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if you want alternatives to ChatGPT, me personally, if you're setting aside, any issues you have with EU data or
Mhm.
whatever, I think the Perplexity Claude stack work really, really well
Yeah.
together. And I think that is a very strong alternative to ChatGPT if it's something that you're looking at moving away from. So I think we can just leave it at that. That's our preferred stack of choice. Well, this actually segues nicely into our news of the week, which is why we wanted to leave Claude till last.
Hmm.
And this one actually landed right in the middle of us putting together this episode, which felt very well timed, given that we just spent a chunk of time talking about why Claude and Anthropic are worth paying attention to.
Yeah, this is one of those stories where the headline sounds alarming, but in reality is kind of nuanced and complicated. Let's get into the background. So back in 2023, Anthropic made a really extraordinary commitment and really set themselves apart from OpenAI. They called it the Responsible Scaling Policy, the RSP. And the core of it was essentially a promise that they would not train an AI system unless they could guarantee in advance that their safety measures were adequate to handle it. So that was it, a really strong central pledge.
And at the time, this was a really big deal because it was essentially Anthropic saying, we'll pump the brake on our own development if we can't prove our safety measures are keeping up. So for a company that positioned itself as really safety first, it was the thing that actually gave that positioning like actual teeth.
And as you probably can guess, they've now dropped that.
Of
So
course.
time, yeah, time broke the story. And obviously, there's been a lot of people talking about it since. But they spoke to Anthropic's chief science officer, Jared Kaplan. And the headline is that central promise, the one about not training models if you can't guarantee safety measures in advance, is gone from the new version of the policy.
And I mean, I'm not going to lie. My first reaction when I read this was, wait a minute, we just spent a whole section singing Claude's praises. Both you and I sing Claude's praises all the time, talking about how
Yeah.
Anthropic is the careful, responsible option. We always talk about the fact that it's the most business safe version.
Mm.
Does this change that?
That's the right question to ask. And it's a little bit difficult to answer. I think the most honest we can be right now is it changes the framing. So even if it doesn't necessarily change the product you're using, it is going to impact how Anthropic continues to build moving forward.
So Anthropic's argument is essentially we, as in Anthropic, made this promise hoping that it would encourage their competitors to do the same and hoping it might become the blueprint for regulation. And neither of those things have happened. Regulation has not materialized yet, and competitors very obviously
Mhm.
didn't follow suit. the current administration has basically taken a hands-off approach to AI development. And meanwhile, the science of actually evaluating AI safety has turned out to be way harder than anyone anticipated in 2023. In
Hmm.
AI terms, 2023 was 100 years ago.
100%, right? And so the conditions under which the original promise was made no longer exist, right? The world has evolved. We talk
Yeah.
about how quickly this whole ecosystem is evolving. So that has changed. That, and to be fair to them, it's changed a lot. So they are, I guess, updating their policy within the new world that is in place.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty charitable read. But as Kaplan says directly, if we pause development while competitors race ahead, the developers with the weakest safety standards end up setting the pace. The world doesn't get safer if Anthropic steps back and someone less careful steps into that space. Anthropic is still pretty safety conscious.
Yeah. However, and look, we understand the logic. However, we've heard this argument before, right? That if we don't do it, some worse will case. The problem is that every company gets to make that argument. It's more convenient than it is, I think, helpful overall.
There's an expert that was quoted in the Time piece, Chris Painter from Meter, which is a nonprofit focused on AI safety evaluations, and he makes exactly that point. He said that this is Anthropic shifting into what he called triage mode because the methods to assess and mitigate risk are not keeping up with how fast capabilities are improving. And his concern is the boiled frog effect, which is basically that danger slowly ramps up without there ever being a really single clear moment that sets off alarms
Mhm.
because you've removed that tripwire essentially.
The new policy replaces it with things like more transparent risk reporting. So they're committing to publishing what they're calling risk reports every 3 to 6 months and frontier safety roadmaps, which again are strong commitments. And I do appreciate the transparency. And Anthropic has always been very transparent with some of their issues, but it's not the same as a hard stop.
So, what do we actually do with this? Because we've just spent a whole episode recommending Claude to our listeners because we don't want to be the ones that are cheerleading a company 1 minute and then don't acknowledge,
Mhm.
when there's an issue with it.
I think the honest answer is that this doesn't change what Claude is as a product right now and how useful it
Yeah.
can be. The models, the capabilities, the things that we talked about, none of that is affected by a change to its internal safety policy document. And relative to most of the competitors, it's still the most, by most credible accounts, doing more rigorous safety work than the other tools out there.
Yeah. So we're not saying don't use Claude. We're saying be aware. That's why we wanted to flag this news story. Anthropic raised $30 billion in February. They're still valued at $380 billion. They're a very successful commercial company, and commercial companies respond to commercial incentives. So it's just
Mhm.
the reality. Okay. So AI gone wrong. We actually have two this week, which we don't normally do, but I just wanted to say up front, one is quite funny. The other one is not so funny. So let's start with the funny one.
Definitely, let's start with the funny one.
Okay. So a guy called Sammy Asdufel bought a DJI Romo, which is a robot vacuum. And Sammy, being a software engineer with too much time on his hands, decided he wanted to control it with a video game controller instead of the app, which, fair enough, sounds like a fun weekend project.
It totally is. And we're going to talk about, I don't know if we get into it, but he did use Claude Code. So this is a very developer thing to do.
He sure did. Yeah. So he used Claude Code to help him reverse engineer how the Romo communicates with DJI's cloud servers. And in doing so, he needed to get hold of the security token, which is basically the credential that proves he's the owner of his robot. Except when the servers sent back the token, it didn't just give him access to his robot.
Yeah, so DJI hadn't really set up the security properly, so that token was not specific to his robot. It gave him access to nearly 7,000 other robots across 24 countries. This is everything from live camera feeds to microphone audio to floor maps of people's homes. So the approximate location of each vacuum based on its IP address.
So he accidentally became the surveillance overlord of 7,000 strangers' living rooms.
Completely by accident, just by requesting normally what you would through their API. And all of this just because he wanted to drive his Hoover with a joystick.
So the broader issue that this story points to is that we are collectively inviting a lot of cameras and microphones into our homes through things like
Mhm.
robot vacuums, smart doorbells, voice assistants, and we're generally not really thinking about what happens when these systems have a bad day security-wise.
Mhm.
DJI say that they've patched it. it's resolved and there's no user action required, but it actually wasn't discovered by their security team. It was discovered by this Sammy guy who just wanted to
Mhm.
control his vacuum with a game controller.
Yeah, and good on him
Yeah.
for reporting it, not asking for anything, not doing anything nefarious. Now that being said, was he just the first person to report it, right?
Well,
How many other people had
that's
identified
the
this?
real question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but effectively, I mean, he
exactly.
could have become the world's best burglar if he had wanted to, right? Which is the headline of the story that I read.
Yeah, amazing.
But look, the lesson here isn't really about this one guy or this one bug. It's about the category. The more connected devices we bring into our homes, the larger the attack surface gets. And he used Claude Code, an AI powered coding tool, to basically build all this in a weekend. So that's really going to accelerate a lot of this problem of all of these problems if we don't put in the proper security.
So our second story is slightly less funny, but it's very relevant to where AI tools are going, given what we were just talking about with agentic AI and Claude Cowork.
Yeah, I saw this immediately and thought of our conversation about Claude Code and Cowork and all the conversations we've been having about OpenClaw and
Yep.
autonomous agents generally, because this is exactly the failure mode you have to design around.
Yeah, so the person that this happened to is Summer Yu, who is, and this is very important, the director of alignment at Meta Superintelligence Labs. Alignment, for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially AI safety. So this is Meta's AI safety
Mhm.
person. Her job is to make sure that AI systems do what they're supposed to do. So this whole story is pretty ironic.
Yeah, so Summer was using an open source AI agent called OpenClaw, which we talked about. She had it archiving old emails from some of the accounts, which seems like pretty standard stuff. Then she said to it, and quote, I'm going to quote her directly because the wording matters. Check this inbox too and suggest what you would archive or delete. Don't action until I tell you to,
Very clear
which is
instruction there. Yeah,
very clear instruction, which is would be part of our what we would tell people to do, right?
absolutely. Except OpenClaw starts wiping the entire inbox. So that's her personal email. She tells it to stop. It keeps going. She tells it to stop again with different phrasing. It still keeps going. She has to physically run to her Mac Mini and kill the process herself manually to make it stop.
And when she asked OpenClaw afterwards what happened, the bot apologized, says she has every right to be upset, explains what it did, and says it'll add her instruction as a permanent rule going forward, which is technically contrite, but also completely useless when compared to deleting your entire inbox. I'll just explain what went wrong really quickly, which is that it goes back to context windows. When she gave it her entire inbox, that basically filled up the entire context window. So she lost the bit of instruction that said to ask her before it did anything. So this is where when we give our agents more information, we potentially lose the instructions to give it. So it's really we have to be really careful about how we're instructing these agents, especially when we're allowing it to do tasks for us.
And what I find really useful about this story as a case study, and one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about it, is the instinct when you hear AI deleted someone's emails is to think that the AI malfunctioned, but it didn't actually malfunction. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It processed the task it was given. The failure was in how it was set up. And I think worth mentioning again, this is someone who really understands
Mhm.
AI, so it could happen to anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the needle in the haystack problem. It remembered
Yeah.
some of the instructions, but not all of it. Is that giant context window? Uh, you know,
So we've talked a lot about OpenClaw in the last couple of weeks, generally not really very positively because there's a lot of security concerns, etc. I think this is a further concern around it. A lot of people are using OpenClaw at the minute. Just bear this in mind that if someone like the director of AI safety at Meta has issues like this, the average person who is not technical is going to
mhm,
run a lot of risks using it. So again, just,
mhm.
something to bear in mind. Okay, so let's wrap this up. If you take one thing from today, let it be this. There is no universally best AI tool. There is the best tool for your specific job, your budget, and where your team already works. Those are all things that are worth thinking about.
And if you're not sure where to start, we would recommend Claude for deep thinking and document work, Perplexity for research. Now, those two cover the majority of what most people, business owners,
Get rid of all
entrepreneurs
this.
actually need from AI. Everything else kind of builds on top of that innovation.
So if you are thinking of breaking up with ChatGPT, hopefully we've given you some options to think about. If you found this episode helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you are using. It actually makes a huge difference in helping other people find the show.
Yeah, and if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button.
Absolutely, like and subscribe. You can also find us on TikTok, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Just search for Early Adopter. Remember, there's no E in adopter.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye, Jess.
See you next week, and hopefully I'll be feeling better. You won't have screaming birds in the background, and we'll be back to normal. Okay.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, bye.
Bye.